Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to Byline Radio, or if you're listening on Catch Up, the Byline Times podcast. This time, can Boris Johnson survive the latest indignity heaped upon his premiership after the fine for breaking lockdown rules during COVID and an investigation by senior civil servant Sue Gray? He's now facing an inquiry by fellow MPs into whether he has misled Parliament. Government whips, those are the MPs who keep their colleagues in order, were forced to abandon plans to try and block the inquiry as they sensed a rebellion by their own backbenchers. One of the Tory party's most prominent Brexiters, the former Minister Steve Baker, who backed Johnson's leadership campaign in 2019, told the PM in Parliament, the gig is up. So is it? Or will Johnson continue to hang on? We'll talk about this shortly with Sam Bright, who is the Chief Investigations Editor at Byline Times. But in this debate in particular, I'm really keen to hear from you and get as many different and varied voices as possible. So if you've got a contribution to make, just if you're listening live anyway on Byline Radio, just tap the microphone on the bottom left. I think this only works if you're listening on your phone, I'm afraid. Tap the microphone on the bottom left hand of your screen. And if you've got a contribution to make or a question to ask of me or Sam, then by all means do so. As I say, sometimes these Twitter spaces are about listening and learning and finding out stuff, but I am really keen on this episode to just find out what you think, really get a flavour of what the UK and indeed our international audience thinks about the future of Boris Johnson. Before we get cracking, just a reminder that the Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast owe no party political allegiance. Neither are we in hock to any corporate interest, nor do we have to bend to the will of any proprietor. We can tell it like it is without fear or favour, because we are funded by ordinary readers of the Byline Times, our fabulous monthly newspaper. So if you want to support independent, honest journalism, please think about taking out a subscription or even a membership to the Byline Times. You'll find details of how to do that at our website. That's at bylinetimes.com. Bylinetimes.com. That's our news-breaking website, and that will tell you where you can subscribe to the Byline Times, which has loads of exclusive content as well in the newspaper. So Sam Bright is with us. You'll read Sam's work in both the website and in the newspaper. Sam, we spoke about Boris Johnson maybe 3 days ago. You thought at that time that he would see this out, that he would survive. Suddenly, it's looking rather shakier for him, I would suggest.
I think through political self-sabotage more than anything else, which is something you can rely on, it seems, with this group of people in Downing Street. It does really have shades of the Owen Paterson case. If we remember, Owen Paterson was accused of lobbying on behalf of private firms. The parliamentary committees decided that he should have a 30-day suspension. Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party decided initially that it wanted to overturn that suspension before being really caught with its pants down by the Labour Party, and then had to U-turn quite dramatically. And this has happened all over again just 6 months later, but this time with the Prime Minister. It just seems to be staggering that they couldn't foresee what Labour was doing. I mean, if they would have tried to block this investigation, the leaflets that Labour would have put out over the local election period would have been brutal, saying that the Prime Minister blocked an investigation into his own conduct, and it would have been hammered home in every Tory constituency in the country. So politically, in the short term, completely agree. It looks marginally better for the Conservatives, but in the medium term, what will this investigation produce? It seems to have given the Partygate scandal even more legs, even if it didn't have any in the first place.
Yeah, you describe it as self-sabotage. Is that really the case? I mean, Labour have clearly played a clever game of politics, because if you try and demand an inquiry, and as you say, if the Conservatives then refuse that and block the inquiry, they're very easily accused then of trying to block the question of whether the Prime Minister misled Parliament, or if they acquiesce to it, which is ultimately now what has happened, then they have this whole situation rolling on for many, many months. So I'm just not sure where you think it's self-sabotage. Is it not just clever politics by their political opponents?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can't win either way in this situation. I mean, it's self-sabotage primarily in the fact that they had the parties. No one forced them. No one forced the wine down their necks, or I mean, apparently they're ambushed by a cake, but the credulity of that is stretched beyond belief. But I think in this particular political case, it was clear what Labour was trying to do and what the worst case scenario was, which was Labour, as I say, managing to plaster leaflets across the country that said Boris Johnson has blocked an investigation into his own conduct. And so if you look at the details of this investigation, although it does give extra legs to the Partygate scandal, it will happen after the Met Police report has come in, which is essentially the most damning thing. I think that in combination with the Sue Gray report will be the thing that will decide the Prime Minister's fate. I don't think fundamentally MPs will decide that he intentionally misled the House, because it's impossible to prove someone's motive where that's concerned. They will most likely prove, which we know already, that Boris Johnson misled the House, may have intentionally misled the House, which, like I say, we know that already. So it gives a few extra front covers that might not look too rosy for the Prime Minister. But if you weigh up those two options, in the medium to long term, a few bad front pages versus Labour managing to hammer the Tories in the short term, potentially creating an electoral catastrophe, it was clear which one they should have leaned towards. And, for the past few days, they've fueled Labour's fire pretty much. And they've only decided at the last minute that actually it's in their interest to sort of push this on as long as possible. And so I think for that reason, that on the two fronts, they've really miscalculated.
At issue here is the ministerial code, and this is like the rule book for ministers. And it says ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation. And the knowingly is the key word here, I think. On the 19th of April, Boris Johnson was asked in Parliament, did you deliberately mislead the House? And he said, no. So clearly there were parties. This was in relation to parties, and he's now been fined by the Metropolitan Police. So clearly there was what, anyway, his critics say are parties, his defenders say was just the serving of a cake and a small drinks gathering. But the Metropolitan Police have found him guilty of breaking his own lockdown rules. As you say, we can't know what was in his mind. So the question of whether he knowingly misled Parliament is a very difficult one to prove, if not impossible. Although I suppose if Dominic Cummings, his former advisor, who has previously said that he warned Johnson about at least one of these gatherings, if Dominic Cummings is called to give evidence and can prove that he did warn Johnson that these gatherings would be illegal, then presumably under the ministerial code, where if you are found to have knowingly misled Parliament, you are expected to resign. That could be fatal. That would be fatal.
I don't know. Even still, I mean, run through the scenario. So Cummings has already testified. So he testified in front of the Health and Science committees. They had joint committees, and he testified last year. So if he does have evidence, he hasn't produced it yet, which seems implausible. And I'm pretty sure that during that committee hearing, Cummings said that he warned, if not the Prime Minister, then his PPS, so his private secretary, that these were parties. The thing is that when the Prime Minister welcomes advice, he's not necessarily agreeing with it. So although Dominic Cummings might have warned him, and Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance may have warned him, the Prime Minister could still have believed, because for whatever reason, presumably idiocy, that they were not parties. So the only way to prove definitively that he's intentionally misled the House is capturing a piece of evidence that suggests on the record that Boris Johnson acknowledged that they were parties. So if he's written an email, if he's said something to colleagues that gives the indication that they were social gatherings rather than work events, I think that is the only way that MPs can really get to the bottom of it, other than finding pictures of him, topless with his tie tied around his head, and is swilling a bottle of prosecco. That's probably the other way that they could pin him down.
Yes. Well, who knows? But of course, he has apologised, and he said he didn't realise that he was breaking the rules, and his defenders have reinforced that message that whilst he acknowledges that the rules were broken, which is why he's had to pay a fine, he didn't realise, even though he drew up the rules. And there was a great in inverted commas defence, wasn't there, by Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was doorstepped by a BBC reporter, and he compared it to a batsman in cricket who, when there is an appeal for LBW, the batsman may refuse to walk from the crease, awaiting the third umpire's verdict. And the third umpire, if he says you're out, then of course you walk as a cricketer because you respect the rules. But that doesn't mean that you knew you were out at the time when the ball struck you.
Yeah, and
it's a convoluted excuse.
It is, and so this is the thing with a lot of these arguments, is that they work. They work in terms of their own parameters. Like, you can see the analogy, but it's just completely taking it out of its context. Like, a batsman playing cricket is just so fundamentally different to the Prime Minister forming laws during a pandemic that killed hundreds of thousands of people, and then breaking those laws. That is just fundamentally different to a game of cricket. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg may see politics as a sport. That's the Oxford Union sort of attitude to politics. But fundamentally, people whose relatives died, and we've spoken to them on Byline Radio before, haven't we, Adrian? They do not see it in terms of this. And as much as anything else, as you say, when the batsman is given out, they walk, they leave, they depart, someone else takes their place. And this has self-evidently not happened in the case of Boris Johnson.
He's still there adjusting his box. And
yeah, exactly. Let's have another go. Let's give me another whack at it. It's not how it works.
Yeah, the Privileges Committee is an interesting thing, because the Privileges Committee isn't one of these standing committees of Parliament, as I understand it. Of course, Parliament has loads of select committees, cross-party groups of MPs made up of backbenchers whose job is to scrutinise the actions of the executive, of the government. But the Privileges Committee is slightly different. It only meets, as I understand it, when called upon, when it needs to meet, and it does have greater powers than some other parliamentary committees. It will, for example, be able to examine the 300 photos of lockdown-breaking parties that were seen by the police.
Yeah, exactly. I think the crucial thing with this in terms of political significance is that a lot of the evidence, unlike other committees, will be held in private. So I'm not sure whether our listeners are regular watchers of Parliament TV, but a lot of the committees are broadcast on there. That will not necessarily be the case in terms of the Privileges Committee. And it also seems as though it might be a bit of a tortuous process. I mean, we've already had the Gray Report, which has taken its time and has ultimately been, substantially shelved, though we had the initial report that advised the Metropolitan Police. And now we've got the Metropolitan Police investigation, which again is ongoing, and, yet more fines may be handed out. And then on the back of that, only after the Metropolitan Police investigation is finished, we will have this separate parliamentary investigation, which could itself take months. There's two ways of looking at this. Either you say this is extending the political damage that will be inflicted on Boris Johnson's regime, because you've got one investigation after another, and this is just not getting blown out of the public and the media's consciousness. Or the alternative, which is, I think, my view, is that the only way that this really hits home is if it's intensified over a short period of time. So if we would have seen, for example, the Sue Gray report released before the Ukrainian war really kicked off, when the media's sort of frenzy over this had reached its peak, I think at that point we might have seen a deluge of Conservative MPs come out against the Prime Minister. And so drawing it out over a longer period of time might actually act to his benefit, especially as it gives him time to sort of recalibrate and decide on which particular element of the culture war or his wars abroad that he wants to refocus the media's attention on.
Yeah, and we've seen, haven't we, with the Ukraine conflict, for example, that simply playing for time, because you never know what's around the corner, can play to your favour. It's a horrible thing to say about the Ukraine conflict. You know, a country has been invaded. Many of its citizens, innocent people, have just been slaughtered by an aggressor, and yet in a perverse way, that has worked to Boris Johnson's advantage. He's deemed by the people of Ukraine, so far as I can tell, to have been a good friend and supporter of Ukraine. And I think many people who oppose him politically in the UK nevertheless would recognise that he has been a supporter of Ukraine in its hour of need, not necessarily the people who want to flee Ukraine through his the refugee schemes, but through military support. So in that sense, he's been able to portray himself, I think, quite successfully as a if not a military leader, then someone who can bask in the reflected glory of President Zelensky in Ukraine. And it's those kind of incidents, isn't it, which you can never foresee, which you can never predict, which can sometimes come to the aid of a beleaguered politician, albeit that the claim that we can't get rid of a prime minister in wartime is demonstrably nonsense. A, we aren't at war with Russia, and B, the war that most people in Britain use as their reference point, World War II, in fact, saw Neville Chamberlain replaced by Winston Churchill in 1940. So, you know, if we can replace a prime minister when we're being assailed by the Nazis, there's no reason why we couldn't replace a prime minister when a country thousands of miles away is being assailed, albeit by a horribly unpleasant aggressor.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you have to consider this in the context of the media climate as well in this country. I think, generally speaking, we have newspapers, or a vast many newspapers, a number of newspapers that lean towards the Conservatives, that are generally sympathetic towards Boris Johnson and his brand of governance. Indeed, he's worked for several of them. And so I think it's only really in moments of intense Conservative crisis, as we saw during the initial Partygate stories, that these newspapers will take a line that's very clearly against the interests of the government. And so when you've kind of got this low-level rumbling saga going on, they're never really going to come out strongly against the PM. And so they have as much interest as he does, or certainly they're orientated in the same direction during that period to kind of help him out and prop up his administration. I mean, ultimately, this might be a godsend to the Labour Party. We're speculating on Boris Johnson's political survival. Perhaps Labour would want Boris Johnson to lead the Conservatives into the next election. There does seem to be a sort of denial among some Conservatives, the newspapers and commentators and politicians alike, about Boris Johnson's potential to win the next election. I mean, all the polls consistently show still that the public thinks he's dishonest, that he should resign. He should resign before the conclusion of the Met investigation. And I think there's not a consideration, probably because of the Tory dominance of the newspapers, about whether Boris Johnson is just fundamentally damaged goods at this stage. And, Labour's just trying to press home that perception, while perhaps not being too displeased if the fatal blow is never delivered before the next general election. Adrian, you muted, lad.
There's always one. There's always one, Simon. There's always one. You're listening to Adrian Goldberg here on Byline Radio with Sam Bright, the Chief Investigations Editor of the Byline Times. And we're talking about whether Boris Johnson can survive this latest inquiry. If you're listening live on Byline Radio, want to join in, and if you're on your phone and you've got the Twitter app, you can just tap the microphone in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen and join in and offer a comment or a question. By all means do so. Very keen to hear what you've got to say about Boris Johnson and this latest inquiry. You're listening to Byline Radio, or if you're listening on Catch Up, to the Byline Times podcast, all supported by subscriptions to the Byline Times. You get more details on how to subscribe at bylinetimes.com. That's bylinetimes.com. You mentioned a little earlier the Metropolitan Police, Sam. One interesting development has been the decision by the Met not to announce the results of any further investigations into the Partygate scandal until after the May the 5th elections. And I think the Met Police report, or the Met Police release actually referenced Purdah. Now, people who are familiar with, say, the BBC or familiar with local government will know that Purdah is a period before an election when you cannot say anything that might be construed as a political comment that might sway people one way or another in terms of how they could vote. This restriction, Purdah, does not apply to the police. And throughout the Partygate story, and particularly when Christopher Dick was the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, there was this feeling that the Metropolitan Police were not pursuing this story as vigorously as they might have done. And the timing of their investigation, when it finally came, was certainly very convenient for Boris Johnson, because it meant that Sue Gray's report, the civil servants report, could not then be published in full. There has been an initial report, but some of the key information has been redacted. And again, this suspicion that the police is not an entirely independent operator here. It may be a false impression that is being given, but the suspicion that it is not an entirely independent operator and that it at some level is bending to the will or the desire of government appears to be justified by this decision.
Yeah, I find this utterly ludicrous. And I think, the Metropolitan Police has not covered itself in glory in recent years. And I think this is just another instance of that trend at a time when it should really be trying to rebuild public trust. This is, like you say, Purdah's in place entirely justifiably so that government departments and civil servants don't make declarations, don't make public announcements that benefit essentially the serving party, the incumbent government. The thing is that the Metropolitan Police, by not making any announcements, is doing exactly the same. So, it hasn't considered the fact that making an announcement or not making an announcement would affect the course of the election either way. And frankly, life does not stop. Crimes do not stop being committed. The country does not stop functioning during Purdah or an election period. And there is not a wholesale ban on things being reported by the media about those things during election periods. And I find the rationale completely astounding that the Met would have decided that this is the reasonable thing to do, not least because this is the deciding, the crucial issue of this election is trusting Boris Johnson, is the Partygate scandal. And for the Met Police not to basically do its due diligence and its normal practice of reporting, I find just staggering, frankly.
Yeah, it is remarkable. Scotland Yard announcing it will not issue any more Partygate updates before the May 5th elections. This is from the Metropolitan Police. Whilst the investigation will continue. Oh, I'm reading from a screen here, which has just blipped, bear with me. Whilst the investigation will continue during the pre-election period due to the restrictions around communicating before the May local elections, we will not provide further updates until after the 5th of May. So they're quoting there the restrictions around communicating that do not apply legally to them. It's just incredible. And I think on that, by the way, on the local council elections, I should just say that I've got a good friend who is a local councillor. He's a Labour councillor. I've got good friends who, by the way, who are Conservative councillors and Green councillors. I've got friends across all parties, let me make that clear. But this particular friend, who is a Labour councillor somewhere in the Midlands, I shall say no more than that, did say to me today that the Johnson dishonesty issue is starting to cut through at the doorstep. And you might think, well, so what? You know, of course it is. But trust me, when I've spoken to this councillor before and praised some of the fine work you've done at Byline Times, Sam, around the PPE scandal, some of the work we've done on the Byline Times podcast in the past with Peter Oborne about the proven dishonesty of the Prime Minister, my councillor friend has said, that's all very well. That's great for people who are massively into politics. But he said, trust me, this does not play out on the doorstep, not least because many people say, they're all at it. All politicians are dishonest. Now, I know this is a kind of lazy reflex action, and to some extent it is fostered, I think, by the media who perhaps have an interest in covering up some of the things that Johnson has done. But there is definitely a kind of a deep cultural disaffection towards politicians and a lack of respect for politicians in this country, which in some respects is not a bad thing. But my councillor friend said now it is starting to play on the doorstep. These successive local council elections, he says he's noticing people are bringing up the issue of Johnson and the question of trust. So, I mean, we'll wait and see what happens on May the 5th, whether it really does play out. But it was interesting that he made that point to me.
Well, it's important and it's quite dangerous in another regard. I think, you know, obviously Johnson takes full responsibility for this. But Labour, I think, has a really crucial role to play, not just in terms of, you know, providing an alternative to Johnson, but to defending democracy. Labour needs to show that not all politicians are the same. Otherwise, we risk mass alienation, I think, amongst the electorate that has been battered by repeated scandals over recent decades. You know, you think about the expenses scandal, you think about austerity, the financial crash, you know, repeated evidence of politicians not acting in the public interest. And if Labour doesn't show that there's an alternative to that, people will either turn to apathy or they will potentially turn to extremism in that situation. And I think we're in quite a fragile state, actually, in terms of our current democratic settlement.
I think it's worth pointing out, Sam, that today the decision to have this inquiry by the Privileges Committee, which again is a cross-party committee of MPs, came about in spite of efforts by government managers to block it. It was the intention of the whips on the Conservative Party to whip their backbench MPs into opposing this investigation. Now, MPs who might not have been willing to vote against the whips, not willing to vote against Johnson overtly, were suddenly finding that they had urgent work to do in their constituencies and were unable to vote. So you had this risk of mass abstentions from the Conservative Party. So the whips in the end just decided it was pointless to try and block the inquiry. But that was very, very telling, because this was the moment when, yes, it might have been convenient, as you say, for Labour to have this all over their local council election leaflets, but it was a moment when the Conservative Party could, from their point of view, have attempted to draw a line under this, and the whips were unable to do that with their own backbench MPs.
And this is the thing, if you think about this in terms of the grand political context and the Conservatives going into the next general election, they don't have the sort of mastermind, for all his faults, and he had, very many. They don't have the mastermind of Dominic Cummings, who really steered them through both Brexit and then the 2019 general election. They evidently have people in Downing Street who, may or may not guide the Conservative Party's mission at the next election, who just fundamentally don't understand basic political nous. They don't get it. And they almost handed Labour an open goal. And to some extent, they offered them some great headlines over these past few days and showed the government U-turning and flip-flopping. So, it's looking, tentatively quite positive for Labour.
Let's get a word with Adam Schwartz, who's joined us. Hello, Adam. Welcome. You're on Byline Radio.
Hello, thanks so much for bringing me in. It's a really fascinating discussion. I just wanted to briefly bring up something about what you were just talking about before with the police's decision not to announce any fines before the local elections. So when they announced this, I decided to do just a bit of research to see if I can find out any kind of guidance on how PERDA relates to the police. I found that they'd published an FOI request in 2019 from someone who basically asked them how the PERDA period relates to the police. And they provided an extract from a document which basically set out how they think PERDA applies to the Metropolitan Police, which is really interesting. Interestingly, this document is actually not available online, and they said that they weren't able to publish the full document. But it basically set out general principles that basically said that the police can't be seen to be endorsing any candidates or be kind of providing resources to politicians or candidates during the period, which seems, pretty obvious. But despite the fact that the Freedom of Information request expressly asked how it relates to ongoing investigations, the entire document didn't actually reference how it would deal with a situation where you had an ongoing investigation related to one of the candidates. So I think it's just, a general lack of transparency in the system about how sort of investigatory structures apply to politicians. And I think it's just part of the kind of endemic problem within the British political system, which is sort of self-regulatory because it generally requires politicians to kind of monitor themselves. And, ultimately the Prime Minister is the ultimate judge of that.
Yes. When Adam, that's a really interesting... Was that your own FOI request?
It wasn't my own. It was just one that I found that the Met had published on their website. But interestingly, it also said that ahead of every PERDA period, they basically update this document. So I think I'm going to send in another request to see if I can get the latest information about what the current status of it is.
Yeah. What's interesting about that, though, is, of course, you would expect the police not to interfere on behalf of any one candidate or another in a local council election. You might think that shouldn't need to be said, but fair enough, it has been said in a document. But we do have to remember, Boris Johnson is not a candidate in the local elections, is he? He's not standing anywhere. So the idea that they could influence the outcome of any particular seat is nonsense. Now, you might say there might be an argument for having some kind of PERDA for general elections. On the other hand, if you were to be arrested, Sam, there would be no restriction on that for whatever crime you would no doubt be innocent of, or you, Adam, or me. The police wouldn't say, "Oh, well, that we're going to stop our normal procedures for those people." You would think, well, perhaps quite rightly, we've got to get this out there into the public domain in the same way that it would be. Justice in that sense has to be blind. But in any event, Johnson is not standing. So there's no direct link between him and any local council election.
No, exactly. And, different to PERDA, but I made an inquiry with Ofcom a couple of weeks ago that themselves set strict broadcasting rules during election periods about the Prime Minister's interview on GB News, which was conducted by two Conservative MPs. So essentially 3 Conservative MPs chatting between themselves. And now Ofcom usually sets regulations that say that politicians shouldn't interview fellow politicians. But these are especially strict rules during election periods. But interestingly, only if the candidates in question, the politicians in question, are actually standing for election. And in this case, this wasn't a breach of rules because none of them were standing. So you could similarly, although, it's not a strict purdah thing, although I guess it is actually a purdah thing. You could very much apply this case to the Metropolitan Police as well. Like you say, this doesn't affect Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, or any of the civil servants. They're not standing in this election. So it's fundamentally ridiculous that they're trying to make this argument.
Adam, where do you think this leaves Boris Johnson? I mean, he's clung on for many a long month. We know that he is a liar. This is a fact that is beyond question and beyond doubt. He's now been fined for breaking his own rules, and MPs who said that would be the final straw, that they could no longer back him if he were found to have broken the laws that he himself set, have stood by him. And now we have MPs on the Privileges Committee looking into him to see whether he's intentionally misled Parliament. I mean, it's a pretty big charge sheet, but as we speak, he's still Prime Minister. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it's really interesting, actually, because I sort of, generally agreed with Sam, earlier in the week or a couple of weeks ago that it looked like Johnson was going to cling on. But I actually think the events that we saw in Parliament today were really significant in trying to understand the direction of where things are going. I mean, the fact that, the Keir Starmer's motion went through on the nod, essentially without any kind of recorded vote, I think was absolutely fascinating to what Tory MPs are really thinking at the moment. And I think, it's obvious that Conservative MPs are not willing to pull the trigger on him. They're not quite willing to either tell him to go, the most of them anyway, or trigger a leadership challenge. But, what they're clearly not willing to do as well is stand in the way of any kind of due process that would actually lead to kind of formal disciplinary processes against Johnson. So I think, at the moment, they're not ready to get rid of him, but they're also not willing to really, get rid of any more political capital to kind of save him. And I think, if they're not willing to do that after one fine, I think, after perhaps, several more fines, I think it's quite possible that actually Johnson will be even more in trouble. And I think particularly after the Sue Gray report is eventually published. So I think, Johnson's obviously not going to go today. He's not going to go tomorrow. But I think, his medium-term challenges are really serious. And I personally can't see the Conservative Party, with its long history of getting rid of unpopular leaders, ultimately willing to take, Boris Johnson for another chance, with the risk of a lot of them losing their jobs at the next election.
Yeah, the Conservative Party are the Watford FC of aren't they? They always biff their leader if they think they're not going to survive. I'm just looking at some YouGov statistics as we speak, and this is a question that YouGov set to members of the public. How well is Boris Johnson doing as Prime Minister? And I think we'd all acknowledge that YouGov, no doubt there are questions to be asked about it, but, essentially is a respectable and well-respected polling organisation. Now, going back to the 9th of April 2020, so we're going back just over 2 years, Boris Johnson had a 66% approval rating. That's pretty high. And just 26 people thought he was doing badly. That's 66% of people thought he was doing well. And he was still, relatively new at that point. And of course, the polls usually show a downward trend after the initial honeymoon period for any prime minister. That doesn't necessarily reflect particularly on Johnson. And his popularity continued to decline to around September 2020. Now, then there was a little surge, a little uptick around the start of 2021, since when it's been pretty much on a downward curve ever since. So we have Johnson now with people saying that he's got Only 29% of people think that Johnson is doing well. 29%. 65% think that he's doing badly. So this idea that the Conservatives, Adam Bienkoff, our colleague on Byline Times, mentioned this to me the other week, this idea that the Conservatives cling to, that Johnson is somehow armour-plated with the voters, well, the polls would suggest otherwise.
Yeah, I think the thing is that lots of people have said that it's baked in to the arithmetic with Boris Johnson, that lots of people know that he's mendacious and that he's a bit of a playboy and whatever. But the thing is that, like, the way in which that behaviour is interpreted can radically change depending on circumstances. So when that sort of mendacity is acting in the interests of a large swathe of voters, primarily those in former industrial seats, who like punching the establishment on the nose and like the fact that Boris Johnson is a bit out there and he's not acceptable. They approved of that during the 2019 election, during Brexit. But when that turns against them, when he's doing stuff that's breaching the rules that everybody was following, those facts of Boris Johnson's personality, they act to his detriment. And so I don't think there's sort of like one hard and fast rule with the way in which people interpret politicians and their behaviours. I think it fluctuates quite often and can hold contradictory positions at times. But as you say, Adrian, from the polling, it's pretty clear that the public mood has shifted. And, we haven't even seen it, despite, Boris Johnson retrenching his support in the Conservative Party, I don't think we've seen the poll shift significantly enough with the general population to suggest that he might dig himself out of this hole.
Much of the rhetoric from Conservative MPs has been about, let's not worry about a cake at a birthday do or a birthday cake when somebody's in the office. This has been the pushback from Conservative MPs who've supported Johnson over Partygate. And a lot of the rhetoric has been around, let's talk about what really matters. Let's consider the issues that are really important in Britain today. And I'm just thinking of a checklist, and not to be deliberately kind of anti-Johnson, but I just think of some of the things that affect people on a daily basis in their lives. If you are an ordinary voter, as I am, you will be dealing with the cost of living crisis. You may be, if you're a small business person, be dealing with the consequences of Brexit and the additional red tape that Brexit has entailed if you're an exporter, even though we were told that Brexit would lead to a reduction in red tape. And you've got a story, I know, Sam, you've printed a story on Byline Times about the reduction in assistance to the different regions of the UK relative to the money that was coming in from the EU. These are kind of the disbenefits of Brexit. We see that the number of deaths associated with COVID, the kind of let's live with COVID philosophy has led, sadly, to more people dying with COVID and the NHS continuing to be overwhelmed. So even if we strip out the question of Johnson's honesty, there's a whole basket of really difficult issues for the government to have to deal with.
Yeah, and not just difficult. I mean, I think you're being generous there, Adrian. I think they've cocked it up. I know I'm talking at 11:15, so I'm probably being more candid than I should be. But in terms of, if you look at across the spectrum, if you look at in terms of the political decisions they've made in Brexit, but also in terms of poverty, in terms of wage stagnation, in terms of housing, the rental market, oligarchs flooding into this country, even regional inequality, which is their big thing now, levelling up. On all those measures, if you look at the data, things have been deteriorating markedly. And the thing that was supposed to be the benefit of all this pain for people was supposed to be balancing the books, the deficit. And even prior to the mass spending of the coronavirus period, they hadn't done that. They just hadn't, Their borrowing rates were roughly equivalent to what Labour was proposing in 2010. And now we've had, massive amounts of public investment that is causing yet more pain for people. So, I completely agree that the Conservatives saying that we're getting back to, that we should be focusing on delivering from the people, for the people, that should actually strike fear into the hearts of most people, because their record's been shambolic in recent history. And I think the problem comes, and again, a great danger for democracy, is when the performance of a government, particularly in terms of health and wealth, is detached from elections. So, having studied elections in the past, the winter of discontent, for example, in the late 1970s, led very directly to the Conservatives winning in 1979 and Thatcher coming in and, changing the economic course of the country. Due to the distortions that take place now, and, for whatever reason, whether that's the media, social media, Boris Johnson's personality, whatever, I just cannot see the cost of living crisis having such an acute impact on Boris Johnson's popularity. Indeed, the Red Wall has been punished systematically since 2010, thanks to austerity. Food bank use has burgeoned immensely in deprived, left behind parts of the country. And yet they still voted for Brexit and still voted for the Conservatives in 2019. And that is really worrying when a government is damaging the health of its citizens and their prosperity, yet is continuing to win votes from those same voters. It is essentially justifying the abuse of the British population, in my view.
Let's welcome Shafi into the conversation. Shafi Musaddiq, who has become a writer in recent times for the Byline Times. You'll read articles by Shafi at bylinetimes.com. Welcome, Shafi. How are you doing? You're right.
Hey, I'm good. Hello, Sam. Me and Sam go a long way back. Donkey's years.
Unfortunately. Unfortunately. I wouldn't have trusted this guy, Adrian, but let's see what he has to say.
Go on, Shafi. What do you want to say?
Firstly, I'm not paid to say this, but I'm Sam's new book, going to read it soon. So looking forward to that.
We'll talk about that another day. Go on, Shafi.
Some really good points being made, and just the point Sam made about the interpretation of political behaviour and politicians' behaviour is really interesting, because we're seeing, with the French election right now, when Macron came into power, he was seen as confident, but now he's seen as arrogant. And I think that bodes well for this side of the channel in the sense that no politician is foolproof, is bulletproof. And I think I'm hearing a lot of people, a lot of Labour supporters who've lost hope, and the word apathetic keeps coming along, but I don't think people should be. So I think that was a really good point there made. And I just wanted to ask about Rishi Sunak, because obviously he was fined as well. And I'm wondering what his political capital is now. Will he, let's put it this way, will he still be around for the next general election?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Go on, Sam.
I'd say no. He'll still be. I think he's tied to Boris Johnson now. If he wasn't already, I think that they're tied to the same sinking ship, the same criminal behaviour. Essentially, the only way that I can see that he might separate himself to some degree is if he's not fined again, but which doesn't seem to be the case from all the stories that we've seen. But Johnson is on other occasions, in which case Sunak can say, look, I was just turning up early for a work meeting and I genuinely was ambushed by a cake, whereas my boss, my gaffer, was tipping Prosecco over his head. And to that extent, I can see that Sunak might make a political case. I just think that the Partygate stuff on top of the non-dom stories the previous week involving his wife, and obviously paying foreign tax on foreign earnings abroad, and his green card status has really fundamentally damaged his credibility. I mean, I saw stories this morning suggesting that Nadine Zahawi, who's been really talked up in recent week by pretty sensible, moderate figures in the media, is too wealthy to run for Conservative Party leader because of the story surrounding Sunak. So someone who's not even been caught up in the Partygate stuff or the non-dom revelations is essentially being ruled out of the race because of the Sunak revelations. Not even referencing Sunak himself. So I would say it's quite tricky for Sunak going into that.
Interesting stuff about Sunak coming out today from Johnson's trip to India, where he's meeting, of course, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He was asked by reporters, "Is Sunak's job safe?" And he said yes. He said he was asked very clearly, would he still be at the Treasury come the autumn, which is when the main budget is set? And he said yes. And he was asked then more generally about other ministers, including Priti Patel. And he gave one of his classic kind of waffle answers, which people are seeing as maybe a hint that he will move Priti Patel on from the Home Office. Who knows? He may just have been waffling. But he did say that Rishi Sunak will be there until the autumn at least. And of course, Rishi Sunak could really have brought Johnson down in the eyes of many commentators had he resigned following the Partygate fine. I think that would have set an example that it would have been very difficult for Johnson not to follow, even though we know resignation isn't really in his bones, is it? But it would have ramped up the pressure on Johnson. So Sunak, I mean, he's got quite, he's effectively acting as a human shield for Johnson. As long as he stays there and doesn't resign, well, it doesn't look like you have to resign, even though you've broken the law that your own government has set.
Well, exactly, and this is the thing, like, what is in it for Sunak now? Maybe he's calculating, as I said, the number of fines that Johnson gets versus himself, and, considering whether he might run in future. But that, I think, as time goes on, that will seem an ever-distant possibility for him. I think his brand was tarnished anyway, to be honest. I think it would have unravelled. And so why is he remaining in post? Maybe he will for a certain amount of time to preserve his legacy as a decent chancellor. But fundamentally, there's got to come a point where he doesn't want to be associated with someone, A, who's broken the law repeatedly, and B, might end up losing the next election. And Sunak might end up being the guy who really detonates Johnson's regime if he manages to find a spine on all this. One thing, Adrian, actually, that just popped into my mind on our earlier discussion in relation to whether Johnson intentionally misled the House. If our listeners watched PMQs yesterday, they'll have noticed that Keir Starmer accused Johnson of saying something detrimental about the BBC in relation to the Ukraine war. Now, Johnson was really unhappy with Starmer saying this and claimed that Starmer had essentially made it up. And Johnson acted with a fury that I have not seen from him before. He was livid at Starmer suggesting that this was the case, which I think was really telling. It was, obviously this isn't any sort of hard proof that a parliamentary committee could use, but in terms of human psychology, I thought it was fascinating that Johnson acted so furiously in the case of Starmer perceived to have lied over the BBC versus the Partygate accusations. He has never acted with such sort of fury and anger over accusations of partying. I think fundamentally because he knows that they are true. I mean, whenever any of us is accused of something really egregious that we haven't done, our immediate instinct is to push back as hard as possible. And that's what Johnson did yesterday over the BBC quotes. And he just repeatedly hasn't done. He's sort of skulked and he's sulked and he's jibed, but he's never lashed back. And I think just from a basic human psychology point of view, I think he just knows he's culpable, to be quite honest.
Yeah, well, this claim that he criticised the BBC came out of the meeting that he'd had with his own MPs following the apology in Parliament, wasn't it? And MPs came out and reported what Johnson had said. And in that meeting, he was apparently far less apologetic than he had been in Parliament. This was a behind closed doors meeting. The Daily Mail, incidentally, made the same report. The Daily Mail, which of course would be very quick to criticise Keir Starmer for getting it wrong, reported this itself. So I'm quoting here from the Mail Online. I'll just read the headline here. Archbishop of Canterbury hits back at Boris Johnson over Rwanda migrant plans. Justin Welby vows to continue to criticise government on moral and ethical grounds after PM claimed Church and the BBC were more critical of Number 10 than Putin. Will Boris Johnson, I ask, be rushing to demand a retraction from the Daily Mail? Of course he won't. Of course, because part of Johnson's modus operandi is to say things which he knows his lapdog newspapers and journalists will dutifully repeat, and it won't always matter whether those things are true or not. And if they're not true, he won't be demanding a retraction. He'll be quite happy for the untruth to gather momentum. That'll be just fine by him. It's all part of the culture war, isn't it? The BBC gets attacked again. Even if Johnson didn't say it, he doesn't mind it being seen more broadly than outside Parliament that he attacks the BBC.
Yeah, exactly. And the hypocrisy of it is just unbelievable as well. The fact that he was so outraged about Keir Starmer, like you say, for one, just repeating stuff that was said in the right-wing newspapers, but also he's just outraged about Keir Starmer apparently saying something that was untrue. This coming from a man who was just, misleads people as a hobby. Well,
it was interesting, wasn't it? Ian Blackford, the SNP, leader of the SNP in the Commons, who has called him a liar on more than one occasion in Parliament and been censured for it by the Speaker, called him a liar in the debate in Parliament over whether there should be an inquiry, and the Speaker didn't challenge him because apparently if it's a debate about whether the Prime Minister or another minister misled Parliament, you are apparently allowed to call them a liar. And this has caused much huffing and puffing, but Blackford for once was able to get away with calling him a liar, which I just think is so funny. I mean, we've published on the podcast, the Pinocchio PM. I had done an interview with Peter Oborne, who has catalogued the lies of Boris Johnson. Peter Oborne, a former supporter of Johnson and one who supported his leadership bid in the Conservative Party.
Go on, Adam, what are you going to say?
Sorry, I was going to jump in there just to say it was really interesting, actually, Prime Minister's questions yesterday and the debate today, because previously it was actually pretty rare, even for opposition politicians, to expressly say that someone was a liar. I think Dawn Butler said it quite famously a few months ago, and it made headlines. But yesterday we saw, I think, 4 or 5 different MPs, including Starmer, who said that Johnson was dishonest and then withdrew it after the Speaker requested he do so. But we're seeing more and more MPs willing to expressly say it on the basis that they know the Speaker will tell them to withdraw it and it won't officially go down in Hansard, but they'll still get the benefit of saying that and it'll still be on TV. So I think you're also seeing increasing sort of frustration of politicians with the kind of inadequacy of the system to really be able to challenge, a kind of habitual liar like Johnson being in office. I thought that was a really interesting feature that I'm sure we're going to see more of in Parliament.
Yeah, for sure. And it's crucial what you say, that opposition politicians are now using it as an opportunity to, I think perfectly justifiably, to one, expose Johnson and expose the flaws of the system. And as a result, the system has a massive problem there. How does it adapt? Does it allow people to call Boris Johnson liars? Or does it go through this perpetual process of having to censure people and a public outcry created because it bans them from expressing those sentiments. That seems to be a real bind that it's not going to get out of when Boris Johnson is Prime Minister, because he's going to continue to lie and people are going to continue to call him a liar.
But I mean, the scale and the persistence of the lying is astonishing. One example, and I referenced the Pinocchio Prime Minister, which was the name of one of my podcasts, and this was picked up in the comments. I'm not claiming, by the way, that I invented that phrase or was the first to use it, but we did use it on the Byline Times podcast. But he was branded a Pinocchio Prime Minister in the House of Commons on Wednesday because he once again claimed there are more people in work than there were before the pandemic. Now, this is simply not true, and he has been upbraided about making this claim by the UK Statistics Authority and has had to admit that the statistic that he's quoting is wrong. But nevertheless, this week in Parliament, he rolled it out again.
Oh, my goodness. I mean, this is doubly absurd, Adrian, as well, because the liaison committee, which is basically like, heavyweight championship of all the select committees, Boris Johnson was specifically taken to task on this for about 20 minutes by one of the members of the liaison committee, during which Boris essentially admitted that he was wrong and that he should refer to it in a different way. And for him to trot that out again after having been explicitly told by an MP that he was getting it wrong and acknowledging that fact, oh God, it's just when does the bile stop?
Yeah, well, the figures that Johnson quotes some statistics which might appear to show that what he's saying is true, but they don't include self-employed people. So the total number of Britons in employment, once you include self-employed people, is 500,000 lower than before the pandemic began. I mean, this is not just a minor technical error. This is not just a cake landing on your desk on your birthday party out of nowhere. And the UK Statistics Authority Chairman, Sir David Norgrove, previously wrote to him to say it is wrong to claim that there are now more people in work than before the pandemic again. And the Commons Liaison Committee asked him if he accepted this correction by Sir David Norgrove. He said, yes, I do. I've taken particularly care today, mindful as I am, of Sir David's chastisement on all occasions. I stress it was payroll employment I was talking about. It's like the claim that crime was down. Well, crime is down if you exclude fraud, which in fact is a crime. It's like, anything can mean anything.
Yeah. If we exclude half the applicable crimes in the country, crime is down.
Yes.
If we're not referring to Downing Street, there were no parties.
Yes. It's sunny outside. What, apart from the rain that's closing down? Oh yeah, apart from that, it's sunny outside.
Just ludicrous. Absolutely ludicrous.
Yeah. Anyway, listen, we've had a good chat about this all. Thank you, Adam Schwartz, for joining in. Thanks to everybody else who's taken part. And thank you to Sam as well. Really appreciate your insight and your knowledge on this. And we will talk about your forthcoming book.
I didn't plant shaft it, honestly. No, he was doing that of his own accord. I appreciate it, but it was not my doing, Adrian.
And it is worth reminding people as well that the Byline Festival is nearly upon us. This is between the 29th of April and the 1st of May on Portobello Road at the Acklam Village Market in North Kensington in London. So it's over that weekend, 29th of April to the 1st of May. All sorts of interesting things going on. It's officially described as a mix of inquisitive journalism, free speech, comedy, music, and all-round entertainment. But there's all sorts of really interesting speakers and performers going on. So check out more information at bylinefestival.com. That's bylinefestival.com. All sorts of luminaries, including our very own co-founder Peter Jukes, Don Letts, the legendary DJ, Bonnie Greer, loads of great names there. So check it out, bylinefestival.com. Stephen Colgrave, our other co-founder, in conversation with Rio Ferdinand. That's going to be really, really good. Lord Alf Dubs as well. So, as I say, bylinefestival.com. And if you want to support our work here on Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast, please take out a subscription to our monthly paper, the Byline Times. You get more details at bylinetimes.com. We'll see you again very soon. Thanks, Sam. See you soon, mate. Cheers.
Cheers, Adrian.
Take care.